Hello, Halifax. How are you feeling? Oh, come on, you're East Coasters. I know you have more inside you. How are you feeling? Thank you so much, and welcome to TD Bank Group Presents the Walrus Talks, Reconnecting Arts and Culture. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I'm the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I have a pretty sweet gig tonight because I get to serve as your host. We are thrilled to be here, IRL, in real life, at the Halifax Central Library. What a beautiful venue, but also streaming live at thewalrus.ca. So hello to the 250 people who registered for the live stream and are connecting with us from across Canada and around the world. Now, I always like to try to make a connection between folks who are in the room and those who are joining us online via web, and a great way to do that is social media. So we encourage you, if you see something or hear something that you'd like to share, put it on social media and use the hashtag Walrus Talks. We wish to begin today's session by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki. We live, we work, and we play on land that belongs to the Mi'kmaq people, the First Peoples of Nova Scotia. And as we seek to build a more inclusive municipality in Halifax, we remember that we are all treaty people and that those of us who are non-Native each have an individual responsibility to acknowledge and to address the centuries of injustice, suffering, and broken promises that resulted from European settlement. At the Walrus, we are honored to carry on a tradition of storytelling, and we invite all of you in the room and those who are online at home to take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, wherever you're joining us from today. A little bit about the Walrus. The Walrus started 19 years ago, really as an optimistic project to tell stories and foster conversations across Canada. And we know that these conversations are complex, but necessary, and more important, each and every day in staying connected and understanding each other. And at the Walrus, they take place in many different forms. We like to spark conversations through fact-based journalism. We're probably best known for our magazine, but our work is also available online at thewalrus.ca and in podcasts and in rooms like this one with the Walrus Talks. And no matter where the Walrus is or how people experience the Walrus, we truly embrace our commitment to be independent, to share multiple perspectives, and to bring together a community of interesting and interested people, that's you, who care about the issues that are most pressing to Canadians. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. This work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. A big thank you to TD Bank Group for making this event possible. TD Bank has supported many iterations of the Walrus Talks across Canada over the years, and we're grateful for their support of these conversations. TD Bank and the TD Ready Commitment invest heavily in both artists, but also the arts and culture sector at large, ultimately to create a better world. So to tell us more, please join me in welcoming to the stage right now the Senior Curator of TD Bank Contemporary Art and Corporate Heritage Collections, Stuart Keeler.
Hello. Don't you hate it when somebody takes your line and then you have to think really fast? Right? Okay, that is my welcoming speech. I am Stuart Keeler. I am the Senior Curator of the Corporate Heritage and Contemporary Art Collection at TD Bank. That is quite a line. You know, we are aligned to the TD Ready Commitment. You might hear this, you might be more familiar with that than I am. But let me just tell you a little bit about that in my brief little speech here. It's a corporate citizenship strategy that aligns our art collection as well. And that is to help amplify diverse voices across Canada and the United States. But what is great is that it champions an inclusive present and future. Art creates conversation. In 1963, yes, 1963, that is when that moniker, that was coined at TD, and to this day, that still is very much our mandate with the TD Art Collection. You see, like many at TD, I care deeply about art, ideas, and culture, and how that connects to share stories. And even my colleagues across the bank, this is something that is very embedded in our culture, and the art collection definitely is a way of looking at that. Now I turn my page. So that's why I'm particularly thrilled, if you will, for tonight's Reconnecting Arts and Culture, which is incredibly timely. Let's admit it, we're all here. So as a curator, I also know that forms of art and culture serve as an important foundation in our lives and in our relationships. It's how we learn and how we share stories. History tells us that. The last 2 years tell us that. So not just today, but for centuries moving forward and centuries past, is that, we've relied on arts and culture to capture the pulse, if you will, and the sentiment of society, and even to navigate particularly challenging times, such as the last 2 years. So let's face it, arts and culture have been a lifeline, a means of connecting us. Connected communities are healthy communities. Even a creative outlet that's captured the collective mood felt by many of us. And I think, again, that's why we're all here, right? So the last few years, hear me out, presented challenges to the arts and culture sector. And in that care of compassion and what TD Banks care about people and communities is where we all galvanize to make change. And so let me ask you, as we look forward to tomorrow, what role will arts play in connecting us again, or back to us, or to new communities? What does this mean to arts and culture producers across our country? And again, who and what new talent will come out of this? What new voices will emerge? And that's particularly extremely exciting to me. These are just some of the questions that I'm ruminating, and I'm sure you each have your own. But at the same time, and now I'm in my closing remarks, is that thank you to the Walrus, our speakers, and everyone in the audience and online for helping make tonight, an engaging discussion to reanimate, to rewrite the world in which we live and the times in which we have lived in the last 2 years, and to kind of open up that door, not only for an inclusive tomorrow, but in a really exciting way where we can connect with one another, see one another, and above all, listen to one another to create that better world. So thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Halifax Public Libraries for hosting this evening's event. The Walrus is proud to be in partnership with Halifax Public Libraries. We wouldn't be here without your support, and this is just the perfect place for this conversation, because when I think of libraries, especially this library, it's an open, safe space where you can come in and discover ideas, art, and community. So the pandemic. I just can't say the pandemic without going like So the pandemic, collective sigh. It's not something of the past. We're still in it. But there is a sense that we're starting to come out of it, hopefully. And this pandemic, it has touched all of us. It's impacted every industry. But in some ways, it's affected the arts and culture sector more deeply than a lot of us realize. Think of a night at the theater. It's just not the same when you can't all sit in the audience and collectively breathe together in a moment. Or experiencing a work of visual art on your computer screen, which is getting better. It's still not the same as looking at brush strokes close up or staring at a sculpture and trying to figure it out and getting lost in the process. But also during the pandemic, we had mediums like film and TV that experienced a great surge. And last night when I was watching the Emmys, when I saw some of those shows that I binged during the pandemic, it was like they were my friends. Not the creators, the shows. I was like, yeah, Squid Game, wow, good for you. Art is such a big part of who we are, and not only how we experience the world, but how we attempt to understand it. And tonight, we're in for a real treat. We'll hear from 7 speakers, artists, academics, thought leaders, programmers. Psst, that's all of you. They're going to be sharing with us how the pandemic has impacted their work and their audiences. So a bit about the Walrus Talks and how it works. 7 speakers, 7 minutes each, 7 different perspectives. These talks are back-to-back, And they're followed by a reception for those of you who are with us in person, which you're all invited to, where we get to carry on the conversation with the speakers and each other. Tonight we'll be hearing from theater and opera director and playwright Peter Hinton-Davis, director of Indigenous Arts, Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, Reneltta Arluk, artist, activist, and educator, Syrus Marcus Ware, I should say Dr. Syrus, artist, writer, and designer, Kamau, senior manager, learning and mediation programs, Toronto Biennial of Art, Mary Kim, filmmaker and co-founder of HighballTV, Melissa D'Agostino, and musician Owen O-Sound Lee. Thank you all for joining us.
Good evening. Hi, my name is Peter Hinton-Davis, and I'm a director of plays and operas in the theater. Everything is the same, but different, is what Gertrude Stein said, responding to the catastrophes of her own lived time. When I think about reconnecting, I immediately run up against this always troubling re prefix. There's a lot of words with re at the beginning of them that ask about what we're connecting again to. Were we ever connected to begin with? And what were we connected to? 2 years ago, at this very time, like everyone working in the theater, we were living in a time where the world was exploding around us with incredible change and horrifying realizations and such alive feelings. And at the same time, we were all in lockdown, living in this kind of theoretical bubble of our own homes and reaching out to each other online. And one of the things that struck me at that time was in a really hopeful effort to try to contribute and dealing with MFA directing students that I was teaching during that time, was how much I wasn't digging theater so much. I wasn't really loving Zoom plays. I wasn't really enjoying that. But I was loving the conversation. I was loving all the things that in the before time I didn't like. The lobby. So before the pandemic, I loved going to theater. I loved seeing plays, but I was nervous in the lobby. I was always private and running away from it all and feeling awkward and uncomfortable. And in the pandemic, I loved the lobby. I loved meeting people, all kinds of people I didn't have exposure to, having conversations with. I loved chat on Zoom and seeing the conversations that started to happen and starting to see a dialogue happening in the theater that only happened in my purview in a kind of select and isolated way. There were, of course, exceptions to that. There were some great things that happened in the theater and opera online. And for me, three I will speak to are the Messiah complex that Reneltta, who's going to be speaking up, was a creator of with Joel Ivany at Against the Grain. And an incredible retake on Handel in our world, on our land, in the face of our realities. 21 Black Futures, produced by Obsidian Theatre in Toronto. Extraordinary, unbelievable, beautiful, poetic, heartbreaking, and inexpressible island that the Tarragon Theatre did online, and I actually enjoyed it more on Zoom than I did when I saw it at the Tarragon. So it made me think, well, what is going on? What is it about that? Because my natural inclination is to find the platform of Zoom and stuff kind of flat. And I was really missing this breathing together that happens in the theater. But those three pieces were both really playful with form, skillful and articulate in the language of what they were working with, and so vitally connected to the content of what they were presenting. So it made me think a lot about what are the languages of different mediums, of different forms. And the theater is a very particular one. You know, it's described and has been described as the always ailing but never dying patient. And there's a kind of, you know, you can read stuff from the 19th century, people going, the theater is dying. And it's full of paradoxes. Because it's live, one would think it should respond to the world we're in immediately and promptly. And yet it's very slow. It's very expensive. It's not the best way. If some amazing thing happened in Halifax today, I wouldn't say, go and do a play about it. Because it'll take 5 years to get it up. It'll be old before it can be new. And at that time, as I was saying, I'm teaching an MFA directing program at York. I was the professional mentor for directing students who were doing their MFA on Zoom and having to contend with that very flat medium to do something they had been building towards and realizing in a play. And the language of a director is many things. Yes, it's words, but words are really about 25% of the full expression of what a director does, which includes design, which includes performance, which includes this very relationship between an audience and the artist. And my students were valiant. My students were amazing. My students really, really taught me about what they needed, what knowledge and privileges I had, and to give it over. Because they have so much to say. I was really inspired. And, you know, it was around that time I was like a lot of you, you know, going down a lot of rabbit holes on YouTube. And, you know, saw one of my idols sort of shatter before me, Katie Mitchell, a brilliant British director, say, live performance is the holy grail that must be abandoned. And what she was arguing for was get into the technology, move into a new time, don't hold on, which is a very terrific lesson, but a difficult one. So hold on to what? And I've really asked myself a lot about change and what needs to change and what opportunity there has been for change. But also, like, what do we want to continue? And this, everything is the same but different, is something I'm sort of encountering a lot as we've moved back to live performance and practice, is seeing, yeah, okay, like, yeah, we really listened and we really thought about it, but now let's go back to doing what we were always doing. So what were we really listening to? What do you want to uphold? What do we want to continue? What do we hold as a value that is important? And connection is a really important part of that, because I've also had the great privilege to witness over the last 2 years the whole makeup of the theater scene in Toronto change. It's different than it was 2 years ago. The leaders are different. The visual makeup of who is running that theater town is a different picture than it was 2 years ago. And it's so welcome, and it's so exciting, and it's so inspiring. So what are we going to uphold, and what are we going to change? And what is the theater we're going to do that speaks in the language that the theater has? So there's a reason I think theater isn't always the most immediate art form, because it's also about, it's not documentary. It's has this element that is poetic. And when the nervous theater people get all freaked out about Netflix is our competition or that kind of thing, I don't really worry about that, because I don't think Netflix is the competition for theater. I think poetry is. I think the theater is a reflective art form, and it requires attention, and it requires absorption in a different kind of way. And it was amazing to me how much we were able to overcome and continue to in the face of a pandemic that seemed impossible. And one of the realities in my own life in 2020 at the beginning was I was being invited to direct a lot of revivals of existing repertoire, what is wrongly termed classical theater. I don't like this word classical because the word class is embedded in it, and it carries with it a lot of presumptions about what that repertoire is. I prefer to call it public domain. And, but I was being asked to do a lot of, like, we want to do a really cool production of a Shakespeare play or something like that. And that's no longer on the horizon. During the pandemic, playwrights reached out. Playwrights came forward with incredible plays, and theaters responded to tell stories about our experience now. And I'm very, very hopeful of a kind of rebirth of a Canadian playwriting and an excitement about Canadian plays coming back. And what I'm really aware of is a question of the audience, building an audience for those stories. I know the writers are there. I know the artists are there. But the work we need to do is about the engagement and outreach to communities about those stories, to ensure that our institutions do not just represent a past that I was part of, but are reflective of the lived experience of the people in the cities and communities that are funded to share those stories and do that work. And that is happening. But like anything, you know, human beings were incredible adaptation machines. We're so quick to adapt and be nimble and go, okay, this is what we're going to deal with. But reflection is an important part of that too. I often felt over the last 2 years, I would just deal with one crisis, and then I would have to put that experience aside to make space for the next one coming on. And I had never been so fully reminded of that as when a play that I am currently directing now by the great Walter Borden, called The Last Epistle of Tightrope Time. It's playing at the Neptune Theatre here in Halifax. Began at the National Arts Centre in January. And the National Arts Centre went to enormous lengths to make that show happen in spite of Omicron, and it was like making a play on the moon. There were only 7 people in the entire building, and every precaution was taken. And we made it through 3 weeks of that to build our show. And then at the end of January, 15,000 protesters showed up in Ottawa, and the Convoy 2020 closed it down. And so it's incredibly resurgent to be here in Halifax, which Walter's from Nova Scotia, to be able to bring that show and present it and forge a way towards connection. So the world has changed. And I live now, each day, trying to challenge this Gertrude Stein epigram or witticism. Everything is different. The challenge is to not let it be the same. Thank you.
Ublomi Atitu Atira Reneltta Arluk. So good afternoon, my name is Reneltta Arluk. And I just want to say how grateful I am to be on the territory of the Mi'kma'ki ancestral lands that have been stewarded so well by the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet peoples who steward the land, the water, and the air. And I am grateful to be a visitor and to say Masichon Kuyanik to Walrus for inviting me here today. I'm going to offer a sharing on perspective. Elder Sykes Powderface, who passed away this year, is a very recognized elder from Stoney Nakoda Nation in Treaty 7 territory. And he was known as the chief negotiator for the First Nation chiefs when they were doing the constitutional consultations. And he shared this perspective with me one day about a forest. So if we look at the forest and we imagine the forest, we see tall trees with healthy bark and big green branches that carry acorns or pine cones. And that provides big shade for the forest that we walk through. And we imagine that when we see a forest. And when we walk along the path, we see moss and we see plants and flowers and bushes. And we walk along and we think, oh, how wonderful that shade that those giant trees provide. But, you know, us being able-bodied, biased people, and us seeing what we see, if we were to lift the bed of that forest, we would see fibrous, intertwined, interconnected roots from those plants, bushes, and flowers that would take over the entire forest bed. And what you would see within all of those fibrous roots, what you would recognize is that the reason why those tall trees can stand so tall and provide so much shade, it is because of those little plants and flowers and bushes are sustaining their height. And so when we start envisioning forests with the shade, we start thinking, oh, how fortunate are those flowers and bushes and plants. But then with the roots, we recognize that that forest is actually quite reciprocal. That without those little plants and those little bushes and those little flowers, those trees would fall. We can do a direct correlation of that to arts organizations and institutions, and those plants and flowers and bushes are our stories, our cultures, and our communities. And that those big trees, those big art institutions and organizations would have nothing to hold them up if it wasn't for the bed of roots that sustained them. When we think about the arts in that way, we start thinking about our role as artists and art leaders. And we start thinking more about sustainability, sovereignty, self-determination, and consent. You can't make a tree out of a plant, a bush, or a flower. And you can't make a plant, bush, or a flower into a tree. And so when we think about our stories and our communities and our cultures, then what we're looking at is we're looking at a way forward together. And if we lean hard into our actual roles, then the ability to create strength within the arts becomes really, really clear. And I think about, what is our role in the environment as artists and art leaders? Are we the bee, the pollinator that goes around and pollinates the flowers and the plants? Are we the morsel that is in the bark that gets munched on by the woodpecker? Or are we the chainsaw that cuts down the tree to create very exciting art in the moment, but doesn't allow sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole? And so, I'm not taking the 7 minutes, but that was something that really came to me when I was thinking about our role going forward, is that we've really worked very hard to be individuals, sustaining ourselves as individuals, but we haven't really stepped back to look beneath our feet and recognize, how are we going to sustain ourselves like a forest? Masicho Kuyanik.
Hello, my name is Syrus Marcus Ware, and I'm an artist, an activist, and a scholar who lives in Tuggerandeau, in the part of Tuggerandeau that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase, the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So we are in unprecedented times. Change is everywhere, and we are beginning to live into the futures that our ancestors only dreamed of. The futures that they fought and gave their lives for. Black speculative fiction writer Octavia Butler said that these would be the times of change. She predicted these change-filled times in her 1993 Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Trickster, which never got written. She said that in the early 2020s, change would be the only constant, and she wrote these words: "All that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you." We have so much to learn from artists like Octavia and from speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is, after all, a chance to practice the future together, as Adrienne Murray Brown encourages us to think. We are seeing changes everywhere, in fact, both progressive changes that are designed to make our world more just, and also a backlash of right-wing rhetoric that is designed to further divide us and to entrench white supremacy more deeply in our society. After the uprisings of 2020, when we saw Black people pouring into the streets, surrounded by allies and supporters calling for Black justice and liberation, when we saw the entire world react to the killing of George Floyd, of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, of Chantel Moore here in Chibuktuk, when we saw actions and activations in Wet'suwet'en and in 1492 Landback Lanes. Indeed, we saw a moment in 2020 where there were these series of revolutionary actions that pushed us forward towards a future that is so much bigger than what we ever dreamed. I'm talking about the kind of future where trans people get to live long enough to become elders. I'm talking about the kind of future where Black liberation is assured, where we have abolition. I'm talking about a future where there is land back, where there is Indigenous resurgence, and where disabled, deaf, and mad people have everything that they need in order to thrive in society. This is the future that we are building towards. We have to remember that revolution is not a one-time event. It's a process, an ongoing process that we are living right now. As Rebecca Solnit says in her poem, Hope in the Dark, mushroomed, After a rain, this is the part where I talk about mushrooms. After the rain, mushrooms appear on the surface of the earth as if from nowhere. Many do so from a vast underground fungus that remains invisible and largely unknown. What we call mushrooms, mycologists call the fruiting body of the larger, less visible fungus. Uprisings and revolutions are often considered to be spontaneous, but less visible long-term organizing and groundwork, or underground work, often laid a foundation. Of course, this is what we know to be true. Revolutions are springing up everywhere as the fruiting body of this much larger fungus. It is the artists who are helping us, along with activists, to blossom these fruiting flowers, to sprout forth mini revolutions. It is artists who are daring to dream that in fact another world is possible. It is artists and people particularly working in speculative fiction who are helping us to imagine future worlds. And I'm thinking here of artists on the margins who are doing what Toni Cade Bambara talked about in 1982 when she said that it was the role of artists from the oppressed or marginalized community to make the revolution irresistible. To make the revolution irresistible. It is artists who are helping us to do just that. And I want to talk about some of the incredible artists who, during the pandemic, during the most unlikely of times, helped us to imagine an irresistible revolution. And I'm thinking here of the incredible artwork of Camille Turner, Dr. Camille Turner, whose multimedia installation Nave from 2022 combined Afrofuturism and historical research to shed light on the entanglement of colonial Canada in the transatlantic slave trade. This video work and installation was shown at the Toronto Biennial in 2022. I'm thinking about the incredible work of land-based artist Syrus Weiss, who is an ethnobotanist, an educator, and an activist from Squamish, Stolo, Hawaiian, and Swiss descent with a practice of more than 30 years, particularly working in the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories out in Vancouver. Syrus Weiss received an honorary doctorate for her incredible work during the pandemic, recognizing her irresistible revolutions and her work with gardens, Indigenous plant resurgence, and growing methodologies. I'm thinking about the incredible work of Davis, an Anishinaabe, Two-Spirit, trans, disabled, and multidisciplinary artist and educator who is in the room today, whose mother is from Treaty 4, Manitoba. Raven was born and raised in Mississauga territory in Toronto, Ontario, and resides and works as a professional artist and curator fluidly between Mississauga and Chibuktuk, Halifax. Their work has us consider disability justice, Indigenous resurgence, colonialism, parenting, justice, and queer freedom. Through performance, video work, photography, and painting, Davis is helping us to grapple with the realities of what has happened here in this place. And during the pandemic, they called on us to respond. I'm thinking about the movement work and the vocal work of performer and activist and Afro-Indigenous storyteller Raven Wings, who is Bermudian and Mohawk, Two-Spirit, trans, and a dancer and activist. I'm thinking about her work as a performer and as the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, and all of the incredible work that she did in the streets, but also through her creative practice with Ilnana Diversity Dance Company, creating Right to Dance and a space for all of us to get to move our bodies. These artists are just some of the many folks who are creating irresistible revolutions through their work. Revolutions that seem so possible and so doable that we can't help but want to get involved. They inspire hope in me, and I know that through these irresistible revolutions, we will finally get free. Indeed, hope is what I want to leave you with tonight. I invite you to dig deep into the rich cultural production of Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous creators here in Northern Turtle Island, even if they aren't being shown in your local galleries or museums because of legacies of white supremacy and colonialism. I offer these Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous artists as an example of hope in revolutionary times. I want to close with the words of Assata Shakur, who reminded us of the power of hope and the belief that change was possible. She said, Love is contraband in hell because love is an acid that eats away bars. But you and me and tomorrow hold hands and make vows that struggle will multiply. The hacksaw has 2 blades. The shotgun has 2 barrels. We are pregnant with freedom. We are a conspiracy. And I am struck by these words, that you and me and tomorrow will hold hands and make vows that struggle will multiply. And together we will finally get free. Thank you.
I'm cold. I can't lie. I think Peter said it at the beginning. Oh, sorry. My name's Kamau. I'm an artist, a writer, and a designer. What's up? Yeah, so I think Peter said it. Were we ever connected in the first place? I never considered myself to be part of the arts sector. And so I'm not really going to speak from that perspective. I always wanted to be an artist. It's the only thing that I ever wanted to do. I believe that artists are connectors. They're connectors of ideas, of experiences, of histories, of stories, of audiences, of communities, and of people. I think artists make a valuable, practical contribution to society. I imagine that a lot of us would be saying the same thing today. I know that that contribution is hard to define, but I think artists make a valuable, practical contribution to our society. However, Canada undervalues its artists. It may respect its artists, it may appreciate its artists, but it does not value its artists. When I say Canada, I mean you. I'm trying to be like direct and practical. I mean you. I mean the people that are sitting in this room. I mean me. I mean arts organizations. I mean arts funders. I mean arts presenters. I mean arts administrators. And I mean artists ourselves. We undervalue and marginalize our own art. Maybe not necessarily because we want to, but because it's the reality of our lives. So I want to tell you a story. I'll probably tell you a few stories. In March 2020, in what became the first wave of the pandemic, I made a decision. I'll tell you more about the decision a little bit later. On March the 14th, I went to performance at the Theatre Center with a group of people. On March the 15th, I closed the Kickstarter for an album project that I still have not completed. That evening, I started feeling sick. Remember, this is mid-March 2020. March 16th, I was shivering in bed. I still didn't know what it was. There was no test at that time. There was no vaccine at the time. I still cannot confirm exactly what I was sick with. March 17th, Ontario declared a state of emergency. I'm from Toronto. Later that week, Toronto declared a state of emergency. Through the spring of 2020, I was locked down alone in my apartment in Esplanade, that's in downtown Toronto. Staying away from people, from public places, listening to news every day for multiple hours. I've never been more isolated in my life. I struggle with depression. It wasn't fun. I was glad to have some time, but a lot of friends of mine, they didn't have the ability to be locked down. Friends of mine are nurses. Friends of mine work in grocery stores. Friends of mine had barbershops that they lost during the pandemic. Many people went into debt, as I said, lost their businesses. I was on CERB for 4 months. In the years since then, many people who worked with the arts, in the arts, left the arts. Many of those people were working class people. To be an artist in Canada is often a privilege. You have the ability to get through some times that other people may not have the ability to get through. many people left the arts. So for artists that I know, the arts was precarious before the pandemic. Consistently precarious before the pandemic. And so the pandemic just times it by 100. We lost a lot of artists in the time of the pandemic. We lost many artists in the same way that we often lose artists to places like New York, Berlin, Lagos, LA, London, Johannesburg, Paris, these kinds of places, big cities with dense populations. Before COVID, I was kind of floundering as an artist. I had been on tour. It looked good on the internet, but I would come back off a tour with like $1,000. I can't live for half a month on $1,000. So at a certain point, I decided to go back to school. While I was trying to get a master's, I was caregiving for a sick father who was, he had a major diagnosis. He almost died in that time. He's lying in bed right now. My parents are two of the first Black filmmakers in Canada, Claire Prado and Roger McTear. Very precarious in relation to their pension. I was dealing with the loss of several friends. I won't name them all. A professor said in and around that time while I was trying to get through my schooling that maybe I should take leave. I said, if I leave, I'm not coming back. I don't have the ability to come back. In the middle of dealing with all of that, I was still debating on whether or not I was going to continue to attempt to be an artist. I handed in my thesis on my 40th birthday. That month, I put my bank card in at the grocery store, and it came back insufficient funds. I paid for my groceries with a credit card. That scared me. So how do I commit to my art? Or how does anybody in that situation commit to their art? If they or me or whoever is living in precarity, if the investment is low, if the investment is inconsistent, if the infrastructure isn't there. So that fall, I booked a lot of conversations around, you finish school. I started having conversations with people, booking meetings to have, to talk about what I was trying to do, all that kind of thing. I spoke to a lot of artists in that time, and I asked them, for the people that I perceived to be successful in what it was they were doing, I asked them, how are you doing this? How are you actually able to make this happen? Not a single one of them said that their primary income came from the art that they created. That's just people I know. That may not be the situation for everybody. Those are the people that I know. Artists ran cleaning businesses. Artists were professors in MFA programs. Artists were waitstaff. Artists work in grocery stores. Artists cut hair in barbershops. Artists did retail. Artists had day jobs. They did their art on the side as a hobby. Meanwhile, people who work full-time in the arts, artistic directors, executive directors, managing directors, arts administrators, arts funders, and artists that had the privilege, for a variety of different reasons, sometimes partners, sometimes parents, sometimes inheritance, sometimes institutions, to be able to actually continue their art without having to worry about that time where you're not necessarily making any profit. That is a long time for the majority of artists. And most people actually don't get through that time. So I'll say it again. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. He said there is no middle class in the arts. Michael Murray used to work at the Ontario Arts Council. He said there's no middle class in the arts. So this is the decision that I mentioned. In the middle of the day, I was in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, scrolling Instagram, as one does. And I got a call from the Canadian government. And a woman I was introduced to in one of those networking conversations that I spoke about, she offered me a short-term contract. This is not what I wanted to do. As I said, all I ever wanted to be was an artist. I had to think about it. I didn't necessarily want to do it. I had several creative projects on the go that this kind of employment would probably hurt, but I didn't have much of a choice. So I called back the following day, and I accepted that job. I've been working there for 2 years now. If you speak to people in the government, a lot of them have the same story. right? Oh, I started in doing an internship. Oh, I started because I was just trying to get through this 3 months. Oh, I started da-da-da-da-da. Now I've been working here for 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, 25 years, that sort of thing. So I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a working artist and that relationship with the sector. Because here's what artists don't necessarily tell you: how they live, what pays their rent, what pays their bills, what pays for their groceries, their food, how much debt they're in, how long it will take them to get out of that debt, who they care for, the toll that that takes. What is their health like? What is their mental health like? What is their financial health like? I thought for myself, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to take care of my father? What if my mother gets sick too? Am I sabotaging my quality of life? Am I sabotaging my stability? Am I sabotaging my ability to potentially retire one day? I'm 43 now. Artists often don't articulate this sacrifice. If artists, and particularly marginalized artists, working class artists, artists that are not in like the arts sector, don't get this, we won't see their contribution. We won't see their contribution. So this is why I said, I'm not sure that we value the artists. I don't mean in theory, I mean in practice. I'm not sure that we value the artists. Often arts organizations, they report one of three things. Number one, attendance, how many people showed up. Number two, frequency of presentation. How many times did this thing happen? And number three, profit. How much money did it generate? None of these have to do with the quality of the art, what it does in the community. None of this has to do with how many artists were actually doing that, or if any of those people could sustain themselves. If it is only presentation, or if anybody got development, production, those sorts of things. So what's not valued? How does art contribute to the city? How does art change people? So how can arts and cultural organizations play an important role in moving art forward? This is the question that we were asked. Number one, pay artists. Don't just pay artists, but invest in the development of artists, their work over the long term. If you don't invest in artists, like any other investment, you won't get any kind of return. I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about all the various things that arts brings to any kind of a community or any group of people. Do not only pay for presentation, pay for exploration, development, time, rent, groceries, education, experiences, business development, financial literacy, intellectual property management, etc., etc. Pay for things that allow artists to grow their craft and their business and themselves. Look at your financial statements. What percentage of the money in your organization goes to artists? When does it go to them? What kind of artists? Maybe Black artists, women artists, Indigenous artists, maybe a combination of all of those things at the same time. And when you do that kind of evaluation of identity, also now evaluate class. How does this compare to others in your organization or other things that your organization spends money on? What percentage of that money goes to artists specifically, especially around development? For instance, you can tell, I tell this to artists all the time, when you're being requested, I'm going over, I think. I tell this to artists all the time. When you're being requested by any kind of arts organization to do anything, look at their financial statements first. Compare that to how much they're paying you. You can do this with the city that you live in. For instance, Toronto's police spending is $400 per capita. Its art spending just hit $25 per capita in 2018. They were talking about that for 6-7 years. You can do this with the entire Toronto budget, with the entire Halifax budget. You could do this with the budget for the Walrus. You could do all these kinds of things. If you don't have the budget to do a project, don't do it. Don't do it. If you don't have the budget, don't tell artists we don't have the budget. Don't do the project. find a way to be able to pay the people who are involved in it as best as you can. I'm going to skip forward. The main thing that I'm saying is invest in artists and invest in artists in the long term. That investment is a practical proof that you value the arts, not in theory, but in practice. Thank you.
Oh, lots of memories coming back listening to these esteemed people talk. Good evening, my name is Mary Kim. I'm coming from the perspective of an arts educator. I am now the Senior Manager of Learning and Mediation Programs with the Toronto Biennial of Art. The Biennial takes place every 2 years, and this year from March 26th to June 5th. After a 6-month delay due to the pandemic lockdowns, we opened our second biennial, entitled What Water Knows, the Land Remembers, featuring the works of 72 local, national, and international exhibition and program artists. As the biennial is situated along the Ontario Great Lakes system, we foreground the water and the land formed by it to attune ourselves to its archives and ecologies. While our physical context is the city of Takaranto, TBA also draws on decolonizing metaphors of sedimented histories in land and water at least 3.9 billion years old, coast to coast. In 2019, our Indigenous advisor, Ange Loff, noted, Takaranto is the site of many rivers that have been built over. These hidden layers tell the story of shifting populations and correspond to several historical layers of Indigenous history going back to 1000 CE. While the Biennial's inaugural year in 2019 brought close to 300,000 visitors locally and internationally, this year we were visited by just over 150,000 in-person attendees and 25,000 virtual audience members. This 2022 visitor count is explained, of course, by the pandemic context. So what does this mean? Opening our exhibitions just as the world was re-emerging has taught me a number of invaluable post-pandemic lessons in community and arts-based programming, and the power and hope that arts and culture bring to learners of all ages. And these are, number one, free and accessible contemporary art. The research is clear. Learning about and participating in the arts helps students develop a range of competencies and skills, not just in creativity, but in citizenship, social emotional learning, and in health. With waning fundings for schools, for arts in our schools, our mobile arts curriculum, we call it the MAC tools, they were co-created with our 2022 artists, centering perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. The concept of a tool is understood as an implement used for building, or conversely taking down and rebuilding. In the same way, we wanted our intergenerational learners, both in and outside the classroom, to access these tools free of financial barriers and use them to learn and unlearn, examine and create new ideas. Our storytellers, more on this later, also actively use these tools in their school visits and public programs, resulting in neighborhood walks, nature observations, painting, sketching, doodling, listening, and performance. Number two, emphasize inclusivity. This, of course, is not new due to pandemic times, but still so important. Since inception in 2016, inclusivity has driven TBA's thinking. We want our collaborators and audiences alike to feel represented and cultivate a kinship, whether from the city of Takaranto or not. No matter how you identify, TBA's context of repatriating Takaranto's living history encourages that your diversity is represented through your relationship to the land that we live, work, and play on. Therefore, land-based learning and personal placemaking concepts were threaded throughout our exhibitions and programs. Dr. Syrus Marcus Ware, in his work MBL Freedom, drew on the idea of abolitionist futures, where we create an immersive experience rooted in social justice, care, and future planning. And while we encouraged in-person visits, we ensured access and inclusivity by live streaming and recording many of our events and talks, and by creating video tours for virtual classrooms and visual description tours for those with low vision. We wanted even the remotest audiences to have access to these representations in deep discussions and reimaginings of a post-pandemic future. Number 3, don't take yourself too seriously. But please do come to our exhibitions and learning spaces with an open, curious mind. We invited everyone to come and make these spaces their own without judgment, without prejudice. You didn't need to know anything about contemporary art. Ghazale of Arzamani's Forced to Float was an outdoor site-specific installation comprised of a large cement-poured circle filled with 7,200 square feet of spongy blue rubber mulch, the kind used in children's playgrounds. Aptly, this installation was extremely popular with school groups and young families. It encouraged participants to not only take off their masks, but play, explore, and be curious. It was the #1 artwork for repeat visitors throughout the Biennial. They turned over the rubber pieces in their hands, bounced around, chased each other, and even sat down to find a quiet place to sit and eat lunch, reflect, or chat. This really showed us that the spaces we created to encounter contemporary art were just as much about rest, playfulness, and healing. Excuse me. Number 4, stories sustain us. The pandemic gave us time to turn inwards and perhaps face a lot of ugly truths about ourselves. Contemplating, protesting, healing the state of the world, all while isolated from our communities. We knew that re-emerging 2 years later meant that a biennial of contemporary art needed to spark conversation, inspire, and seek solutions. Our storyteller program was our way of interpreting the traditional docent tour. What better way to connect? What better way to reconnect than through our stories? Our storytellers mediate the context of each artwork and artist, but also align their tours with personal stories, difficult conversations, and connections that embodied the artworks. Each of our 5 stellar storytellers were encouraged to bring their lived experiences to each art encounter. What resulted were very intimate and warm gatherings, albeit masked sometimes, where storytellers delivered to over 3,500 attendees over the 72 days of free public art. Finally, number 5, remain open and nimble. I mentioned coming to the Biennial as an audience member with an open mind, but this is a lesson for me as well as a cultural programmer. In some ways, the pandemic brought us closer together than ever through distance. Rallying together over the radical shifts in our collective consciousness created a new kind of honesty with ourselves and with each other. We moved to quicker calls of action, urgent protests, movements, awakenings, without a moment left to spare. Is it through great periods of upheaval that creativity emerges? Perhaps. With the ground shifting beneath us, our openness keeps us nimble to relational action. These radical navigations of how to pull together through uncertain times has magnified our focus on preserving our stories, strengthening our relations, and sustaining these lessons as we move towards the next iteration of the Biennial. Hope to see you there in 2024. Thank you.
Hello. What a great time here, gathered together in this beautiful space. What a treat after a long time of not gathering. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the Walrus for having me, and it's so splendid to be on a panel with all these wondrous speakers. I'm in awe. My name is Melissa D'Agostino. I work primarily now as a filmmaker, and I'm the co-founder of a worldwide streaming site called HighballTV that I built alongside my filmmaker husband, Matt Campagna, who is here. I will reference him later. This is why I gesture to him now. So what is HighballTV? Well, think Netflix, but with less The Floor is Lava and more The Power of the Dog. No offense to The Floor is Lava. I definitely watched that show during the pandemic. It's very quiet in here, so I guess nobody else did. I have no shame about it. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how building HighballTV in the way that we did helped us to connect with filmmakers and audiences alike in the pandemic in ways we could never have expected. I've been making film and digital media projects for over a decade now, and traditionally the way to finance these projects has been by applying to a small number of public and private organizations that in order to access funds. For film and television in Ontario, there are like 5 that you go to, that you go to administer and gatekeep the funds. And they have very specific and narrow views about what Canadian media should get produced, programmed, and promoted. Now, Matt and I make things in a very unique way. We have lots of different skill sets, acting, directing, writing, editing. So we like to keep our teams very small, nimble, and focused. And the projects we've made under this method had garnered us some attention and some accolades internationally. But every time we went to these Canadian funders, we were told that what we were trying to do was impossible. I will repeat this. The thing we had already proven we could do was deemed impossible. And yes, it was quite baffling that our entrepreneurial and our innovative ways weren't appreciated in Canada, because elsewhere in the world they were seen as a feature, not a bug. And so we knew we had something to offer in terms of building a structure. And we're not particularly good at taking no for an answer. You might even call us annoyingly persistent, and you would be correct. So in 2017, we noticed that smaller digital broadcasters were launching streaming platforms to share their work, and we realized that with our skill set in art and technology, it would probably be easier to build our own broadcaster than to access one in Canada. And we were right. So we built HighballTV in our living room. Or out of our living room, I suppose it doesn't live there, but from our living room. We didn't have money from a giant telecom company like Bell does, who owns Crave. We didn't receive any public funding like CBC, who owns Gem, some other streamers you might watch and enjoy. We did meet with investors, and they wanted us to grow quickly and try to compete with larger platforms and cash out by selling HighballTV as a startup, but we knew that wasn't for us. Artistic freedom and invention was key to us, and we knew that if we built something sustainably over time and carefully curated both the library and the means by which we supported the site, we might have a chance at longevity and creative freedom. Soon enough, we had a captive audience, a growing library of films, and we became recognized by CAVCO, which is the governmental body that administers Canadian tax credits, which meant we could make films, which was the thing we wanted in the first place. Hurrah. And then the pandemic happened, which sounds like a very dramatic moment right now where everything could collapse and fall apart, but like any good movie, there's a twist. And somehow, when the pandemic hit, we were uniquely positioned to grow, not stall. Our viewership tripled since people weren't going out to see movies anywhere, they were home, and we had built a thing they could access. We were able to expand our team, hiring 5 full-time employees, and it turned out that because we were already working in a smaller, more inventive and agile way, so many of our goals were suddenly within reach. You see, all the larger productions, the bigger, more cumbersome companies, didn't know how to move forward in the spring of 2020. They couldn't safely operate their business models at that scale, so sadly, in our industry, like so many, they had to take this unfortunate and indefinite pause. And that meant that investors didn't have films to finance because films couldn't be produced safely. Or could they? Enter HighballTV and our unconventional approach that everyone had dismissed. The first film we made in September of 2020, before vaccines or rapid tests were available, was shot 1 actor at a time on a green screen with a crew of 5 people, including me reading every other character opposite each actor. So somewhere there's an audio version where I play every part in that movie, which I will not release, just for the betterment of the world. We're coming out of the pandemic. I won't put us back in a chaos. As it turns out, we were one of the first film productions back up after the pandemic shut everything down. And we could only do it because we already worked in a more intimate scale, more directly with filmmakers who embraced technology that allowed our small team to work safely. This was the inventiveness that the old system couldn't harness and so rejected. We were jacks of all trades and so considered masters of none, but everyone forgets the last part of that phrase. A jack of all trades is master of none, but oftentimes better than master of one. Ha ha. We're a unique example of a company that thrived during COVID. We don't take that lightly. We know what a challenging time this has been for many and continues to be. I mean, the pandemic is not over, despite all of our dreams that it would be. But we do celebrate what we've been able to achieve because of how we work and who we work with. In addition to expanding our team and the film library on our site, we produced 5 feature films so far. Gave several directors their directorial debut, including myself, including directors of color and queer directors who could not get funding for years for their projects. And we were able to create a community of filmmakers who have a new excitement about making art in Canada, who own the rights to their films and get to tell their stories on their own terms. COVID revealed inequities in many industries, and certainly ours was no exception. In the film and TV industry, these include racial and gender biases, unfair labor practices, predatory producers, to name a few. And Canada loves to roll out the red carpet for large American companies to shoot their projects here. But these companies don't pay into public funds. They often underpay our talent compared to the Americans they hire, while withholding residuals and profit sharing from artists. And they're who we prioritize. Whether it's billionaire-backed global corporations or our own Canadian telecom oligopoly, there's no greater danger to inventive art than a monoculture run by the few. The biggest lie is that a large media company is valuable simply because it is large. Smaller players can make an opportunity out of a crisis in a way that larger ones can't. We can be nimble. We can take care. If we care about our own stories and our own storytellers, we need to embrace innovative Canadian companies. Because there's so much to be gained in diversifying our entertainment sources so that many outlets with different points of view are making the film and TV decisions in our lives. My sense is that we often feel that this is out of our hands, that these are big corporations and we can have no effect. But sort of to Ian's point of like valuing artists, actually valuing with the things that our society deems valuable is so important. And we all have so much power in this. You know, if movies have taught us anything, it's that a scrappy rebellion or a tenacious underdog can emerge victorious by the time the credits roll, right? We love those stories, my God. They make the most money, right? And a crisis can wreak havoc, yes, but it can also galvanize people through connection and through change. And the best way I have ever found to connect with people and imagine change, which is really the first step to being able to enact it, is to imagine it. The best way to do that is through art. I know no better way than through the minds of artists and their work. And that's certainly true for us at HighballTV, as we got to connect with and support hundreds of artists over the past 2 years, which blew our minds. I hope you'll consider leaving today your power in all of this, in what you watch and where you watch it, in knowing the practices of the company that makes it, because you have the power to do that. Support a local artist or an arts organization. If you don't find one that you love, one that serves you and your community, build it, support it. That's the way forward. We build something new, we support something new, hopefully something better for more of us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Owen Lee. I'm an artist, a musician, and incredibly humbled to be among such amazing speakers this evening. The message that I'm going to speak about was actually echoed a few times in a few different speeches, but it's simply, there is power in pivoting. You might have already read a bit about me through my bio, perhaps, but I would like to give you a closer look into my life for the sake of context. I've had a love for music for as long as I can remember, but I've been pursuing music professionally for the past 15 years. I was born and raised in Toronto, which is where I began my professional journey, but 8 years ago, I got married to a Scotian woman and made the decision to move here to the East Coast in 2014, which is where I've been ever since. As a musician and music professional, I did feel anxiety about leaving the big city for a smaller town and what opportunities might be available for someone like me in a smaller market, but I quickly discovered that there was still power in pivoting. There's an old proverb that says, "A gift opens the way and ushers the giver into the presence of the great." This proved to be true in my life because within months of moving to Nova Scotia, I became and still am the musical director of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Upper Hammonds Plains. Thank you. Thank you. Where I minister through music on a weekly basis. I also became the choir director of the Nova Scotia Mass Choir, a position I held until 2019. And along the way, I also became the program coordinator of a local music organization called the African Nova Scotian Music Association, which is a position I held throughout the pandemic and to this very day. I'm also a solo artist performer, as well as a touring musician for several different artists. And now that I've established the different hats that I wear, I'd also like to mention that I'm still married. My wife and I just celebrated 8 years of marriage, and together we have 5 children, 2 boys, triplet daughters. So, thank you. So Melissa, I definitely know what the floor is lava is. Needless to say, there certainly was power in pivoting to Nova Scotia. I was very confident in the trajectory of my life and musical journey by the start of 2020. At this point, I'm working full-time as a musician and busier than ever. I'm traveling and performing across Canada and internationally. My family's healthy, my bills are paid, my children are growing. By February 2020, my entire calendar year was filled with shows, tour dates, speaking engagements, workshop opportunities throughout Canada. I was fully convinced that 2020 was going to be a pivotal year for me. And indeed it was. But not in the way that I anticipated. A month later, COVID-19 started ramping up and the world began to lock down. One by one, my gigs were getting canceled, tour dates were being postponed until further notice, until they were eventually canceled altogether. Various workshops and events that I had planned for 2020 were all canceled, and the confidence that I possessed coming into 2020 slowly transformed into fear and anxiety, as I began losing more and more revenue by the day. Being an entrepreneur doesn't typically come with sick time or vacation time or any kind of paid day off. As an entrepreneur, lack of business directly affects my ability to provide for my family. Sure, there's emergency funds and CERB, but how long will it last until I have to find other ways to feed my kids? I felt like I was tumbling from the mountaintop into the valley very fast. But then something interesting began to happen. While being locked down, I began to find provision in the midst of a global pandemic. The pandemic showed me just how important artistic contributions were to my community, because even though people were locked inside trying to avoid this virus, there was still a deep hunger for music. I began to watch the world around me pivot to virtual. People were looking to be entertained by any means necessary. In-person concerts pivoted to online concerts. In-person workshops and conferences were now being hosted via Zoom or Teams or some other virtual medium. And even though religious gatherings weren't allowed, I faithfully showed up to an empty sanctuary every Sunday throughout the pandemic. Just me, my microphone, and my keyboard, singing my heart out to a video camera, knowing that on the other end of the camera, there were hundreds of people tuning in from their respective homes week after week, looking for hope, looking for peace. When you're presented with an obstacle, you can either dwell on how difficult the obstacle is, or you can shift your focus, find a solution, and pivot. At the beginning of 2020, I was stressed and anxious over the amount of cancellations that came down all at once. But by the end of 2020, I understood that music is an essential service, and that not even a global pandemic could stop the world from consuming it. There was power in shifting my mentality and deciding to pivot. Mind you, virtual concerts do not compare to live music by any stretch of the imagination. But I did what was necessary to continue feeding my family. I also forged new relationships and gained new fans around the world because of the pivot. I performed in front of virtual audiences of thousands because of the pivot. I've won awards and received accolades for work that was completed after pivoting. I stand before you today sharing my experiences as a musician during the pandemic. But if I decided to dwell in defeat and not pivot, chances are this opportunity to speak to you may not have happened. I was once told that life is not just about what happens to you, it's also about how you respond when things do happen. The pandemic was hard to navigate for all of us, but it also showed me how resilient we can be when put to the test. I wouldn't quite say that I'm thankful for COVID-19 or the pandemic, but I will say that I'm grateful for the opportunities that were birthed in the pandemic and that are being birthed now because of it. There is power in pivoting. Thank you.
Wow, I can feel the hope, despite the challenging time that we've been through and continue to navigate. There's a lot of hope. Thank you to Peter Hinton-Davis, the power of the lobby. The power of the lobby, power of those conversations. Reneltta, Arluk, lifting the bed of the forest and recognizing what's there and how beautiful and powerful it is. Dr. Syrus Ware, living into the futures, practicing the futures, and building the futures. In Kamau, I mean you, he means us. It's on us, we're part of this. We can do something. And I think that's a challenge for all of us to figure out how we can start truly valuing art. Mary Kim, the importance of creating inclusive spaces to welcome curious minds. Melissa D'Agostino, you can create something that's somehow impossible, and highlighting the importance of building something and then supporting it. And Owen Osound Lee, there is power in the pivot, and I think you reminded us beauty in the pivot as well. Thank you again to TD Bank Group. There's no way we could do the work we do without our partners' support. Now I'm going to invite our talkers to stand up as they make their way to get ready for the reception. And while they do that, I'm going to tell the rest of our audience in person and at home a bit more about the Walrus. If you enjoyed tonight's talks, we have more. The best way to stay in touch with us is to opt into our newsletter. So if you're watching online, we're going to be sending you a follow-up email and you can click right through. And for those of you in person, in the reception, we're going to have a Walrus booth. Stop by and say hello, and we'll make sure we're in touch. In these turbulent times, it's crucial that reliable media remains available to everyone, especially Canadian media that covers arts and culture. At the Walrus, we like to say we're a unique animal because we're a registered charity that produces award-winning journalism, events, podcasts, and more. And we do that thanks to our community support. So if you enjoyed this free event this evening, consider making a donation. You can do so at thewalrus.ca, click on donate, or again in the reception, come by at our booth and you can make a donation directly. All gifts of $20 or more will receive a charity tax receipt. A few more shout outs. Thank you to Stuart Keeler, Alicia Rose, Chris Marone, and everyone at TD Bank Group for tonight's conversation. Thank you to Osa Kachin, Laurel Taylor, Chris Rogers, Shelby Kennedy, and the rest of the team at Halifax Public Libraries. Thank you to our annual sponsors you'll see on the screen behind me, Air Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, and Shaw. And thanks to each and every one of you for attending. You know, it's interesting talking about this hybrid world because we're still living in it, but it excites me that we can both be back on the road, but to continue to share these talks with people wherever they are. All of you are part of the Walrus community. Now, I've been told if I do a little clap, that black curtain behind me is going to move, and then we'll be in the reception. So, shall I test it out? That's right. Hey! Looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, everyone.